while I was doing some research for this, I stumbled on this Pew study where they actually asked the people in these generations if they self-identified as being in those generations. And actually, millennials are the ones that identify the least as millennials. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not a huge fan of the labels. I'll say that right now. Not being in the millennial group, it makes me feel a little bit like this, right? So. And so, I'm going to do this, and it is interesting for all the reasons Mary Beth said. This is a very distinct cohort, and how they interact with media and stuff like that is really, really important. So, being a BookNet presentation and the way my mind works, there's not going to be enough graphs here, so I thought I'd hit you with another graph. And when I was looking at this image on the internet, I thought to myself, well, does anyone know this reference anymore? Am I going to be stale and dated, or should I be hip and with it? And so I went to Google Trends, because that's the kind of thing I do. And I looked up Old Man Yells at Cloud on Google Trends, and look at that spike. I am so with it, guys. So stay with me now, stay with me. But yes, Google Trends, a great tool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reading and book buying. So we do, as you know, you've heard me talk a little bit about this, we do lots of surveying. We do a reader survey once a year about some of the stuff Mary Beth was talking about. A little bit about media consumption, but particularly about reading books. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One of the interesting things that we've seen over the last year or so, and may be counterintuitive on some of the data we've already seen, is that millennials are actually reading more books than the other cohorts combined. So 86% of our millennial respondents last year said they read a book. We're only 81 of the other cohorts, and that's all the other cohorts kind of matched together. Not only did they say that they read more, 40% said they were going to increase, that the reading year over year had increased. 40% said it stayed the same, and only 20% said it declined. That's quite a bit higher. That 40% increase is quite a bit higher than all the other cohorts combined. So they're reading more. This number, this 86%, we do our millennials as 18 to 34. The Pew study does it a little bit different, but the numbers follow the same pattern in the US. The millennial cohort in the US is actually reading more. Okay? One of the things we can do in some of the tools we use, and if you've seen the presentation last year, we can do some sentiment analysis too, and I like to pull a couple of these in because I think it's kind of interesting. So what this is that this is the question we asked. Did you read a book in the last year? And you can see a bunch of circles there. Some are more visible than others, and there's a yes axis and a no axis. So what this shows, and I just pulled a few here as an example, these are traits about the respondents who answered yes to this question, right? So the bigger the circle, the more respondents said yes, they read, and the closer it is to yes, the more significant it is to those people. So this will back up some of what Mary Beth was saying, and you'll see as I go through the data, it's more proof in the pudding. So what this is saying is that people who read read more last year tend to be people who shop online, at least monthly. They also happen to be wine consumers. So we can draw a parallel there. And I'm joking a little bit about this. And there's a bunch of other circles there which I've shaded. Some of them have exactly the behavior that Mary Beth was going on in the morning. These people are very thoughtful, they're opinionated, all of these different things. Those are the other circles. I just dim them to make it easier. On the no side is things like watching a lot of TV, right? So those people tend not to be readers. So I'm showing this kind of an example, but this can be interesting because you can pull sentiments out of here which can directly relate to marketing. So I'm going to show another one that may have a little bit more of that in a minute, but this would be stuff that you could actually take back as a tool to use to market. So this tool is called AYTM. You may have heard me talk about it before. It's called Ask Your Target Market. It runs small surveys. You pay by respondent. You can build surveys, and it'll do the sentiment analysis for you. So they have a massive database of respondents, and they have a massive database of concepts. And it'll match up the concepts to your questions, and you can find people. They'll even go back to those people if you want. So it's a neat little thing that you can do A/B testing and things like that with. So in our reader survey, we asked which of the following have you done in the last year? So 54% of millennial respondents said they read an ebook last year. That's opposed to the 86 who said they just read. I dropped the missing e-reader off the top, so those bars at the top are how they're reading, the blue bars, sorry, are how they're reading the ebooks. So they're reading on a tablet, reading on a mobile phone, or reading on a laptop. Those are the three in order last year. The missing one is at the top is e-readers at 23%. This is very similar to the same millennial kind of numbers coming out of the US and the UK, with the exception that we are higher in phone here in Canada than we are in some of those other territories. Which leisure activities would you say are your top two choices for spending your free time? So remember, this is reading. So reading ranks number 5 here. I'm not sure if we should be concerned about that or not. We don't have enough year-over-year surveys to see this number sliding. Sorry, this is reading books, by the way. So we don't have enough year-over-year numbers to see if this is sliding or not. But it is a bit of a concern because the other cohorts, it comes in at number 3. So reading is down below playing video games, watching TV, spending time with family, and browsing the internet. The internet's going to come in here a lot, as it did with Mary Beth. Also in the other territories, other English language territories, millennials also stated they're spending more time using other media, as only 40% of the millennials read books for more than an hour each day in the US and the UK. So also along with this, we ask some sentiment questions. So green means that millennials agree more than the general population with these sentiments about reading, and red means they disagree. So statements about books and reading. Millennials read books for entertainment and pleasure. They read to relax. And physical bookshops, they say, are more important than the rest of the cohorts, which may seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to kind of circle around that. They don't prefer to read ebooks to printed books. They don't only read on holidays, and they don't find it difficult to read books. I think that's all good news, but it's good to know. Devices. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on devices, but it will dictate, and it goes again with some of the stuff Mary Beth said. So this is what type of device do you own? 55% of our respondents say they own a tablet, 19% say they own an e-reader, 93% own a smartphone. Smartphone penetration in Canada is getting pretty close to 100%. Most millennials are not planning on buying a device in the next year. Okay, that's changed year over year. We saw in previous years, I think the tablet thing was really saying that they're going to buy another device in the next year, but now they're saying they're not going to. If they are going to buy a new device, they're going to buy a smartphone. That's what they're telling us. They are not going to buy an e-reader, unfortunately. What format did you read? So 89% read print books last year, or read a print book last year. 28% listened to an audiobook. And I'm going to explore these a little bit more. 54% said they read an ebook. Last year, millennials read more ebooks and listened to more audiobooks, but read the same amount of print books as the other cohorts. So the others, I didn't put them up here, the others were exactly the same at 89% for print, ebooks were at 50%, and audio was at 24%. Okay. We think that millennials may be more format agnostic. So those that are reading digitally, what are they reading on? Blue bars through the rest of the graphs will pretty much be millennials, and orange will be the others. So most millennials will move between devices too. That's another question we ask. So they'll actually read sometimes on a smartphone, sometimes on a tablet, sometimes on their laptop. And they'll actually, within the same book, move between devices. That goes with what Mary Beth was saying as well. So, but you'll see here, it's a little bit all over the place. But the bar I'd like to pick out, and I'm going to come back to again a couple times, is the smartphone bar, which is the third one down. So almost double the amount of people, millennials, will say that they're going to primarily read on their smartphones, 20%. That's big, and that's changing all the time. So, and we can talk about the devices having bigger screens and all those things. So we also asked, what are the following things that you've done? This is just a general question. I thought it might be interesting. The subscription number here at the bottom, 4.3%, is really small, but is growing. And I'm going to revisit a few of these other ones later. The cooking one, sorry, got cut off there, is 54%. But the takeaway here is the millennials tend to do these kinds of activities a little bit less. The library one is weird, and I'm going to come back to that one too. So that's kind of the reading and leisure study stuff. Tim will be presenting more of that this afternoon, so this is a shout out to Tim's session. Come to that, and he'll be exploring it in a lot more detail. So I'm going to talk, this is where I want to spend most of the time. I want to talk about book buyers. So this is specifically from our book buyer study. So we asked throughout 2015, so it's pretty recent data, we asked approximately 1,800 English-speaking Canadians, 500 millennials, about the books they bought. And it turns out that we have pretty detailed data on about 5,000 purchases. So this is a pretty robust data set. So before I go into it, I'll just kind of do what our panel looks like and the breakdown in demographics. So our panel for millennials, tends to weight even more female. Across both the other cohorts and millennials, they tend to live in central Canada. That's just our population breakdown. Millennials are much more likely to be in urban population centers. They're more educated, as Mary Beth touched on. They have a full-time job as opposed to being retired. They're single, and the average age of our millennials in our panel is 27 years old, which is about right in the middle, almost right in the middle. For the other cohorts, it comes out to about 56. So, not only do millennials read more, they buy more. So in our buying panel, the blue bar is millennials, they buy 2.8 books in a month, whereas the other cohorts combined buy 2.6 books per month. Millennials bought 27% of all of the books that we registered a sale of last year. And that goes similar to their population density, which Mary Beth talked about again. So just looking at the other cohorts for a second, this is the number of books bought per month by the other cohorts. So the millennials are the highest one. They buy 2.8 books per month, followed by Gen Xers, Boomers, and Silents, to an average of about 2.6 to 2.7 books per month. We also do a lot of kind of slicing and dicing to look at this as formats. So this is not just millennials, and I'll talk through what's going on here. This is our whole panel, and I just thought it would be interesting to bring this. So across the bottom axes is the 4 quarters of 2015. The different bars represent the different formats of the books, and then the percentages are there. So you can see the top bar is paperback. Most of the books that are bought through our panel are paperbacks. 51% of all the books bought last year were paperbacks. And then the red bar is ebooks. And I think there's a correlation there. I can't say there's a causation, but there's a correlation between the green and the red, right? So as paperbacks go up and down, sales of paperbacks go up and down, ebooks go up and down. So it's cannibalizing, I hate to use that word, they are related to one another, the paperback and the ebook. It doesn't do much to the hardcover. People who buy hardcovers just buy hardcovers. And some of that is gift giving, some of it's collecting. I think that the paper version of a hardback, the hardback version of paper books is much more of an object. People like to have the hardcovers. And so we see that kind of in the data as we go. And then the audiobooks are kind of the straight line at the bottom. So just to kind of put this a little bit in context, over the course of 2015, when you average this out, 19% of the unit sales that we registered in our panel were in ebook format. I've already mentioned 51% were paperback. The UK says they're at about 27% ebooks. I find that a little hard to believe, but that's what they're saying, Nielsen's saying. And the US is between 25 and 30%. So we're just kind of a little bit below that, in our panel anyway. We also just ask, this is the breakdown by cohorts. So the takeaway here is that millennials buy less ebooks, they buy a little more paperbacks. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about, and the audiobook number, while it's not a big number, it's worth exploring. I'll come back to that one too. So 23% of the others bought an ebook, 23% of others bought an ebook last year, 24% of millennials bought an ebook, but they bought less of them, so it pulls the average number down. 67% of millennials bought or read an ebook last year. So they're still very focused on ebooks, but I'm going to come back to the kind of price and value discussion that Mary Beth was bringing up earlier, and I'm going to kind of explore that again in a couple slides as to what might be happening here. City dwellers in Canada buy the most print books. They buy, on average, about 2.13 print books per month. And millennials buy slightly less, city-dwelling millennials buy slightly less print books than do the others. Rural millennials buy, on average, the most ebooks. Seems kind of weird. What does this picture have to do? I think it's all related to the small house movement. I don't think that they have the room to store all those physical books anymore, so they're buying more ebooks, right? So you've seen HGTV, all the small houses, everyone wants a small house. They can have mine. So how do they acquire those books that they read? Most of the purchasing for millennials, the ebooks, most of the purchasing for ebooks by millennials is done in-app. Okay? Then they go to free sources, not necessarily the library. They purchase through the browser, they purchase on an e-reader, they go to the library, and they go to the subscription. So we don't ask in our panel, did you pirate a book? No one's going to answer that question truthfully anyway. Well, actually, you'd be surprised when anonymous surveying what you can get people to do. But that free source is not library. The second bar is interesting. Is that open content? Or is that stuff they're getting off torrent sites? We don't really know, but the number's quite high. So maybe it's something we'll watch year over year and see what they're doing. So, but that in-app number's quite high, 30% for ebooks. And I think that Kobo and Amazon could probably back up some of that number. When we ask them which platforms they use to do their reading and buying on, 46% say they use Amazon Kindle, 30% say they use iBooks, 26% say they use Kobo, followed by Overdrive for reading and purchasing. So I'm going to just jump back to this audiobook number because I think it's worth exploring a little bit. What we've heard, because we've done some audiobook surveying too, what we've heard is that audiobooks are kind of going through a resurgence. The year-over-year growth in audiobook sales in the US and the UK and Canada is huge. It's kind of those press releases you used to see from AAP where they were saying ebooks are growing 2,500% month over month. Like, we're just not seeing those anymore. So now they've decided to do with audiobooks, right? When the percentage is almost zero, you get 1,000% increase pretty quickly, right? So, but we are seeing a lot of growth, right? So audio is a growing segment, so it's something we should pay attention to. I've done lots of presentations on this. It just came in my news feed. Audible reported yesterday selling 1 million Harry Potter audiobooks in 4 months. Now that's a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the billion of print versions, but that's just in 4 months, and they're charging a premium price. And they sold 1 million of them. And a lot of those went to millennials, I think. So 28% of millennials said they bought or listened to an audiobook in the last 12 months. 18% of those people do it only in digital. So it's really an important segment. And why do we think that it's an important segment? It goes to some of the stuff Mary Beth was talking about. Millennials are busy. They're doing lots of things at once, and audiobooks really lend themselves to that. When you talk to people who listen to audiobooks, it's very rarely that they're just sitting down listening to audiobooks. They're commuting, they're on transit, they're walking their dog, they're cleaning the house, they're doing multiple things. So this is a really interesting thing that we need to watch. I know there's a lot of initiatives that are taking advantage of it, but it's quite important. So I've sliced and diced it. So one other thing about audiobooks, this probably doesn't come as a big surprise. Millennials almost 100%, it's not 100%, but very high percentage-wise, listen on their phones to audiobooks. All the other cohorts tend to listen on their tablets. So phones, very popular. So here's one of these graphs again. A lot of this is just silly. I was playing with it late last night trying to get a joke out of it, but it didn't really work because there's too many circles. But I'm going to milk it for everything I got. There is some interesting stuff here. And remember, the yes axis is over here on the side. It says A1 yes. And the closer the circle, the more significant, the bigger, the more respondents. So there are some takeaways here, and it may be really hard to read. But this is where this tool can be kind of useful. People who said they listened to an audiobook last year also tend to have Google accounts and be signed up to Google+, more than the general population. So, how would you take advantage of that as a marketer? Well, maybe you should put some dollars to Google+. Don't do that, but there could be something here that you could take advantage of. The other is that I thought was kind of interesting is the people who listened to an audiobook last year are much more willing to pay with electronic payment mechanisms. So they have PayPal accounts and they have Google Wallet accounts and they use them. That's interesting because we don't see that from other cohorts. They are also big consumers of Adobe products. I think they're all EPUB professionals, but there's an Adobe Creative Suite circle there. There's another Adobe. There's quite a few things. And even some of the stuff Mary Beth was talking about earlier. They're volunteers. They buy shorts. They like Dairy Queen and Burger King. So there's some silly things here, but you can pull out some very interesting stuff, and the tool allows you to slice and dice the relevancy quite a bit here, so it's kind of cool. So I'm going to jump over to subjects now. So millennials are more likely to buy these subjects. They buy more fantasy, romance, and science fiction in the fiction categories. They buy more education, business, and science in the nonfiction. Millennials buy more genre fiction at a higher percentage than anyone else. So being the data house I am, I went right away to sales data and ran the last 7 years of those categories to see if I could find a pattern, because that's the kind of stuff I like to do. There's no pattern, at least in print book sales. You know, the romance is all over the place. Business and economics is trending down. This is in paper format, by the way. Fantasy is trending down. I bet you, if we see the next George R.R. Martin next year or in the next 20 years, that will trend up. Business and economics is going down. Science fiction. So there's really no pattern. Science fiction is going up because of The Martian. There's really no huge pattern to their paper book buying, but like graphs. Millennials buy less mystery and detective, suspense and thrillers, history, cooking, and self-help. Now, part of that may be that they get some of that stuff online and may just be stuff that they're not interested in, right? So have to be a little bit careful. Mystery, detective, suspense, and thrillers, we're working with averages here. The Gen Xers and the Boomers pull those way up, so it's quite easy to be underneath the percentage that they have. So when we're comparing the others, they kind of pull it down. I did look at juvenile, but the numbers are really small. It's interesting that early learning books are being bought more by the others. I guess maybe not too interesting since they probably don't have, some of the millennials don't have kids. Same applies to educational books. They get bought a lot more, but there's not a pattern that I could really pull out. Again, the graph. So this is those topics. Thrillers are trending up, cooking down, mystery and detective down, self-help, flattish, and history slightly down. No real pattern. We don't have any book sales numbers like that, so I can't tell. So just jumping ahead, we ask, how did you obtain books last year? So millennials don't stand out that much. They're slightly more likely to have bought an ebook, but not much. A little odd that the ebook numbers are higher here when we look at a single month. This is over the course of a year, but it might go to that pattern where they're buying them, but not buying a lot of them. Where do they shop? Also touch very much on Mary Beth's stuff. 46% of all of our purchases in our panel last year were made online across all formats. That's huge. That's almost 50% of all books being bought are being bought online. So this is broken down. The top group of bars is millennials. The bottom group is others. The green bar is online. The blue is bookstores, discount grocery, and other. So while we're pretty consistent online across everywhere, where we see a little bit of a difference is that others tend to shop in non-traditional bookstores. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that behavior in a second. Whereas, maybe contrary to what we'd expect, millennials are bookstore shoppers. They tend to go to bookstores a little bit more than the rest of the population. So this is similar in other territories as well. So I'm going to explore these in a little bit more detail as well. So we also ask, where did you buy it? Amazon is #1 for millennials. 20% of purchases were made at Amazon. Indigo Stores is #1 for non-millennials. Amazon #2. Generally, all the online channels are more important outlets for millennials, with the exception of Kobo, which trends towards an older demographic. So looking at that online shopping, we also ask sentiment questions, or we ask, why did you shop at this particular store? Most of the answers we get from millennials are online related, whether they shopped at an online store or not. They kind of really talk about delivery. They want fast delivery of product. They don't want to wait for it. They want to get it really quickly. They really like the ability to sample or look inside. Those are really important kind of decisions to buy at a particular store to millennials. When we look at the other cohorts, most of the kind of sentiments we get about why they shop places are physically related. So it's that the store has a good selection. And this may be the key one to that shopping not at bookstores. They were shopping there for something else anyway and decided to pick up a book. And I'm going to come back to that one too, because that's kind of a weird thing. So Mary Beth talked, and I've talked a little bit about pricing and value. I think that's an interesting thing. So I've broken these down by format and by cohort. So the first group there is millennials, others and all. Audiobook is kind of the pinky, ebook is green, hardcover is the first orange, and paperback is the second orange. So what's interesting here is that millennials are very price conscious. And all of the survey responses we get, they are much more likely to compare print and ebook prices and much more likely to compare between online stores. And maybe that's because they do so much online shopping or online browsing, as Mary Beth was saying. That's really interesting that they will do a lot of research, but on average, across 5,000 purchases, they pay more for the books they buy. So I'm not really sure what that means. They do more research, but they pay more. Now, it may be that they're buying some stuff for school in here, and it's pulling the average prices up. That could definitely be a possibility. I didn't pull textbooks out, although there's not a lot of textbooks in our panel. When we look at ebooks, the things in ebooks that trend that will encourage millennials to buy those books or pay more are almost all weighted towards convenience. Okay, it's portable, it's searchable, they can integrate. That's a big thing we hear all the time. They can integrate their ebook into social media platforms. They can share tagging. They can do all of these things. That's really important to the millennial cohort. So they're more concerned with the functionality and convenience of an ebook and less concerned with the price. They're very value conscious, but if you give them more value or more quality, they're willing to take price a little bit out of the equation. Going with that, bundling is something that it seems millennials are interested in. 42% of millennials have some interest in book bundling. Either they would pay a higher price for a physical and digital bundle, or they would pick one book over another if it came with an ebook. That's quite a bit higher than the other cohorts, which are at about 25% interest in those things. So something that might be worth exploring. So along with price and the sentiment, we just asked them, how would you quantify your book spending? Again, the free sources here are pretty interesting to call out. So more on print than ebooks, about 32%. More on ebooks than print. I only purchased print books, quite high. I only purchased ebooks, quite low. I attained all my books from free sources. That's quite high at 16%. Something that we'll continue to watch. So back to that shopping at multiple places. Millennials plan their purchases a lot more, and this might have something to do with the online researching or the value, but they really are not impulse shoppers. They plan what they're going to buy, whereas the other cohorts are much more impulse-based, and this might have something to do with shopping at Costco, buying the bagels, and picking up the latest thriller, or whatever that is. There's some behavior there that's happening. How did you discover the books that you read, purchased or read? So 54% is word of mouth. That's still really important. This is for millennials. Browsing through stores, browsing online are all really, really important. These values are almost identical to the values we see coming out of the US and the UK. So word of mouth is still really important. Social media is important, public libraries, and so on down the road. And radio and television ranks last because they're not watching a lot of live TV or listening to the radio. How did you become aware of this book? So there's a lot here. I'm going to focus on two of these quickly. I'm going to look at the recommendation bar because it kind of goes again to what Mary Beth was talking about. So the most important review and recommendation mechanisms for millennials are in-person, bookseller websites, social media, and blog or forum or review websites, online stuff. Non-millennials, in-person and bookseller are still number 1 and 2. But they're even more important for non-millennials. Online is a much larger driver for millennial recommendations. Some other interesting things are that celebrity is really important to millennials. They look to celebrity endorsements. And TV is more important to non-millennials. Because of the importance of in-person recommendations, we asked a follow-up question. How have you shared and recommended books? Shared, reviewed, and recommended books. 54% of people, again, said that they share or review or recommend books by word of mouth. Number 2 is social media. Number 3 is online, retailer websites, publisher websites, author websites, and book clubs. So it's this word of mouth thing. And again, these numbers mimic other studies we've seen. We also asked what you do online. They read short stories online, millennials. They've added a book to a watch list a lot more than traditionals. And downloading a free extract and sample is a little more important for millennials. We actually hear about free samples quite a bit from millennials. The other thing back to how do you become aware? I'm just going to focus on this browsing because it goes the other way. It seems to trend a little bit more towards the non-millennial cohort. So this is online and in-store. So where were you browsing before you bought the book? Still physical store is the number 1 place. Bookseller websites, fairly important, review websites, online community, and social networks. Awareness created by browsing is very important for millennials, 60% when you add up all the different stuff, because there's some others ones that aren't appearing here, 60% to 47% for the others. Physical stores are hugely important for all book buyers, but are more important to the other cohorts. I've left off publisher websites, video sharing, and other social and others that kind of make up the 100%. Tumblr and Instagram are more important with millennials and growing. Twitter is a little bit more important for millennials, but not significantly. Facebook is much more important to the other cohorts, and we know that they tend to trend a little older. What made you decide this book? There's a lot of data here. It's kind of a little bit muddy. Again, reviews and recommendations is very important. Film and TV ranks quite high for, or film and TV tie-ins rank quite high for millennials. Low price is important. Study and work might be related to the price. What type of device do you own? I showed this already. I don't want to spend a ton of time on devices, but I want to focus on this 93% that own smartphones again, as I called it out once already. So when we kind of ask what activities are you doing, you can see these percentages are quite, 17% of the millennials say they read a short story on a smartphone, they read a complete book on a smartphone, or they bought or listened to an audio book on a smartphone. So just showing again the importance of the smartphone to the millennial group. Even more, 11% of millennials say that their phone is their primary reading device. 14% of millennials say they read on their phone several times a week. Quite a bit higher than the other cohorts. Almost at the end here. I did want to pull some library data, but it was really muddy because it's kind of weird. Millennials say that they visit the library more often, but they check out a lot less books. And I think there may be some confusion. We say public library, but I think that some of the data we're getting back is school libraries, and it's kind of hard sometimes to get exactly what's going on. When we look at millennials versus others, they borrow the same percentage of ebooks, they borrowed more audiobooks and less paper books, but they buy more paper books, so it's all kind of odd. They're less likely to, on the visits that they do go to the library, the millennials are much less likely to check out a book than the other cohorts. They're going there for some other purpose. So in summary, because that was a lot of graphs, they will be available after, millennials are still reading and buying books, but they are very price conscious and are focused on the value quality of the book. They will pay more if they see value. They've told us that. Online as a discovery and shopping channel are hugely important, but millennials still go to stores. Peer reviews and recommendations are really important, whether they be online or in person. Audio is a growing format for all cohorts, but even more so for millennials. Millennials seem to be format agnostic. Mobile is still important and growing. That's it. So coming soon, you can get from us our Canadian book market. We'll probably make this millennial data available to either on the blog or in a paper, so you'll be able to grab that. We're always interested in what other research we can do about book buying and book reading behavior. So if you don't talk to us here, please get in touch with us at research@booknetcanada.ca. Tell us what you'd like us to look into, and we can do our best to look into it. Thank you.